It's commonly said that war is hell, and it's also confusing, bizarre, pointless, and surreal. You know about the acts of heroism, but these war stories puzzle historians to this day.
When your nickname is the Desert Fox, you know you're pretty good at the game. Even Allied leaders admitted to having some respect for Erwin Rommel, with UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill claiming that the German commander was a formidable adversary. Cool nickname and Churchill praise aside, a more fitting moniker would have been the Desert Procrastinator. Robert Citino, senior historian for the National World War II Museum, puts a lot of the early praise on Rommel thanks in part to one Adolf Hitler.
Hitler really likes him. He's very, very close to Hitler, and Hitler admires him.
Yet these tactics came with a less admirable side. According to Citino's estimation, Rommel may have been more enamored with the glamour of war than the nitty-gritty details of supply chains and logistics. As such, he didn't spend much time worrying about administrative duties. Yet attention to all these boring bits is often what makes for true success in war, and it surely falls on a general to ensure that such things are addressed. If you're still not convinced, consider that Rommel never managed to seize control of the vital Suez Canal, or take a hard look at what may be his most significant failure, the inability to put a stop to the Allied invasion of Europe on D-Day. With such big fumbles on his resume, Rommel's enduring reputation makes little sense. Just to show how important the facade of greatness was to the Nazis, despite being part of the assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, he was still given the choice of being exposed as a fraud or chewing on some cyanide. He decided to keep the Desert Fox nickname and hope no one figured out the truth. We did. By early 1942, many Americans were understandably on edge. There were a lot of folks expecting a mainland attack on the US. Sightings abounded along the west coast of Japanese forces in the sky and seas, with most dismissed as mistaken identities. There were a few real attacks. A Japanese submarine attack on an oil field near Santa Barbara took place on February 23, 1942, and the often forgotten bombing in Oregon a few months later. But the best remembered today is the one with the most clicky name, the Battle of Los Angeles. On the night of February 24th, military forces received instruction to prepare for an unconfirmed Japanese assault. In the first hours of February 25th, radar supposedly picked up signs of an invading force. LA went into a blackout.
No lights anywhere. Not a cigarette is allowed to be lit on the street for fear of giving away any type of location to a potential.
Searchlights pierced the skies, and troops began firing an estimated 1,400 anti-aircraft rounds at something. Yet nothing came down. Some claimed to spot Japanese planes or a massive balloon, while others saw only clouds and smoke. No one was directly injured, though some reported deadly heart attacks and car accidents, while shrapnel damaged homes. The most likely explanation is a false alarm, though the scope of the panic remains confusing. For a while at least, it must have seemed as if Germany had a nuclear weapons program on lock. By the late 1930s, German scientists had already conducted and publicized their experiments on nuclear fission, in which splitting atoms produced potentially immense and destructive power. As Nazi Germany formally entered into war and began taking territory across Europe, its scientists worked to refine their materials and more reliably produce enriched uranium for use in weapons. With the hindsight of history and the devastation first wrought on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by American nuclear bombs, it's clear that the Nazi nuclear program failed. But why? Germany once had serious advanced science at its fingertips, as evidenced by the US push to incorporate Nazi scientists and engineers into its own post-war programs via Operation Paperclip. Part of the explanation centers on the fact that refining uranium and developing weapons was massively complicated and time-consuming. The Nazi government, lulled by the successes of conventional weapons, may have neglected to fund the nuclear program until it was too late, or they may have been scared off by the expensive but only semi-successful V-2 rocket program. It didn't help that key German intellectuals like Albert Einstein fled Europe to avoid anti-Semitic persecution, and subsequently lent their help to the American Manhattan Project. So it turns out being cheap and being bigoted cost the Nazis the bomb. Good job, Nazis. From 1943 to 1945, an estimated 425,000 German POWs were sent to detention centers across the US. Many arrived in rural Texas, where extra land made it easier to establish camps. Texas was also selected because the 1929 Geneva Convention maintained that POWs should be sent somewhere with a climate similar to where they were captured. For a German soldier apprehended in North Africa, Texas was deemed Africa hot, so that matched up. The Geneva Convention also required that POWs and their guards live in similar quarters, meaning that conditions were decent for German prisoners, to the point where locals derisively called a few Texas camps the Fritz Ritz. Captured soldiers likewise weren't required to work, though some did so anyway to alleviate the boredom and earn a bit of money.
By doing work like this in the shoe shop, captives are able to buy cigarettes and other luxuries.
Conditions were so good that very few tried to escape, and those who did hardly appeared to fear much retaliation. After the war, some attempted to stay in the US and even occasionally succeeded in becoming American citizens. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, ostensibly to keep American military zones safe from foreign infiltrators. What it really meant was that some 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, many of them citizens, even second and third generation citizens, were forcibly relocated to internment camps with little regard for their livelihoods, property, or civil rights. You probably knew about the US treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, but knowing that they were treated worse than captured Nazis makes their situation all the worse. December 7, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy, but there's a lot more to the tragic day than even history buffs know, and these are some of their burning questions. You know the basics. Japan had imperial expansion plans for the entire Pacific, and the US was in the way, so the Japanese decided to bomb Pearl Harbor. Simple, right? But even within Japan, there was much back and forth prior to the strike. On one side, you had war-hungry nationalists favoring action, and on the other, there were more moderate voices expressing serious doubts. This last group included the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who warned that an extended war would destroy Japan. Spoiler, he wasn't wrong. He said the only chance was an intense, sudden attack that would thoroughly destabilize the US. If his plan worked, the US wouldn't retaliate. But after the attack, the US declared war and officially joined World War II, so Yamamoto was extra wrong. The popular narrative of the Pearl Harbor attack is that it took everyone by surprise. Everybody was pretty much aware of Japanese expansionism and increasing tensions, but still, the idea of a sudden attack simply wasn't on most minds. Why didn't the military leaders read the writing on the wall and more obviously discuss how the US was going to be drawn into the war?
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Okay, the truth is, well, complicated. Part of the problem was that the command, and therefore communication, was often divided. General Walter C. Short was in charge of the army stationed in Hawaii, while Admiral Husband E. Kimmel commanded the Pacific Fleet. The two didn't always communicate for security reasons. This meant that when Kimmel's Navy intelligence lost track of a steadily growing Japanese fleet less than 2 weeks before the attack, he didn't let Short know. Neither of the two commanders were able to set up an effective cross-department communications network, leaving key radar stations short-staffed and poorly informed of Navy aircraft maneuvers. Even then, surveillance managed to pick up suspicious Japanese activity, including aircraft launches and the appearance of miniature Japanese submarines near Pearl Harbor shortly before the attack. Though slow communications and sluggish response times meant these early warnings made little difference. Even with the major miscommunications between military branches, it's hard to understand why both Short and Kimmel didn't do more to prepare for an attack. US forces had received 3 warnings from their own government in 1941, on October 16th, November 24th, and November 27th. That last warning, which came barely a week before the December 7th attack, told Kimmel that, quote, "This is a war warning." He was instructed to execute an appropriate defensive deployment, though the missive didn't contain details about dates or potential target sites. But this is the biggie. No one knew where the attack would take place. A declassified memo discovered in 2011 listed the West Coast, Panama, and the territory of Hawaii as places to keep an eye on for an attack. So it's hard to prepare for an attack when you don't know where it's going to be. Also, do you know exactly where the Japanese attacked on December 7th? Do you? Keep watching. You might be surprised.
We'll win through to...
By the time Japanese forces actually began moving across the Pacific towards Pearl Harbor, the attack fleet had grown seriously massive. It included 6 of the nation's best aircraft carriers and more than 420 planes. It was the largest attack force assembled by Japan. So how did it manage to make it 3,500 miles practically undetected? Part of the plan involved intense preparation, which included monitoring US communications and military movements. Training areas were also closely guarded, with foreign vessels escorted out of sensitive areas while Navy-related news stories were censored. Admiral Yamamoto didn't even inform many of his military compatriots of the plan either. The ships were then sent on a far northern route that was meant to keep them out of shipping lanes. For security reasons, no radio communications were allowed, leaving personnel on the ships to communicate via lights or flags. It also helped that the ocean is ginormous and contained plenty of room for Yamamoto and his associates to map a route that kept such a large force out of sight. The thing you probably didn't expect is that it's super easy to hide in the ocean. There was one key moment where a different decision could have changed everything, and it came at a mobile radar unit stationed on the northern coast of Oahu. There, Privates Joseph L. Lockhart and George E. Elliott Jr. were told to sit inside the unit van between 4 and 7 a.m. The Lockhart was in charge of the unit's oscilloscope. That's a device that can pick up electric signals, like the kind from a massive formation of aircraft. Elliott briefly took over near the end of their shift for practice. Just after 7 a.m., he detected a blip on the scan that indicated, you guessed it, a massive formation of incoming aircraft. But with such technology still in its infancy, neither private could tell exactly how many planes were approaching and where they were heading. Lockhart called the Army Information Center, where he reached Private Joseph P. McDonald. When McDonald consulted the lieutenant who was on duty, however, he was told just to ignore the signal because it was probably just a group of American planes. The signal was a bit over 130 miles away when they spotted the formation. It could have been enough time to deploy proper defensive maneuvers. Though the Pearl Harbor attack was devastating, it could have been far worse. But why wasn't it? It has to do with flares. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was in charge of tactical decisions for the first wave. There were two possible plans, one if the Americans were surprised, and another if U.S. forces caught on before the attack. One flare would signal a surprise attack, and two indicated a more cautious no-surprise plan. Fuchida fired 2 flares. He should have fired 1. In fact, he later claimed to have fired 1, but thinking it was a dud, set off another. Yet, given the complexity of loading and firing flare cartridges from the cockpit, Fuchida may have meant to fire 2 all along. It also could be that Fuchida lied because the attack became an uncoordinated mess and did not strike the Americans as hard as originally intended. In attempting to cover up for himself, he may have been trying to shift the blame for the mix-ups that day onto other commanders. Pearl Harbor was a devastating attack, but it could have been a lot worse if Fuchida only let off 1 flare. 2,404 people were killed on the U.S. side, including 68 civilians and 1,177 on the USS Arizona alone. 5 battleships sank in the harbor, as well as 3 destroyers and a training ship. Many more suffered serious damage.
Launched a surprise attack on American forces at Pearl Harbor.
One of the most horrifying details of what happened to the bodies centers on those trapped in wrecked ships. Afterwards, some reported hearing the taps and bangs of sailors trapped inside. The salvage crew that raised what was left of the USS West Virginia reportedly found the remains of sailors, along with a calendar that marked off a chilling 16 days stuck inside. It took decades for the U.S. Navy to admit the details of the story to the sailors' families. But how could sailors be left inside a wrecked battleship for over 2 weeks? While crews worked desperately to save service members in the wreckage, they were presented with some seriously difficult choices. The area was often coated with fuel leaking from mangled ships, so cutting through metal decking could spark a deadly blaze. Likewise, creating an opening in the wrong spot could flood the interior. Over 900 bodies were left behind in the USS Arizona and declared buried at sea. You've been waiting for this the whole video. Did the US know the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming? In its most basic form, this conspiracy maintains that President Franklin D. Roosevelt and other high-level government officials knew darn well that Japan was going to rain down devastation upon Pearl Harbor. Yet, they said and did nothing, hoping both to bring the US into the war and keep Britain in the conflict. Plus, with the US officially in the war, it would be able to more publicly aid allies in the fight against the Axis powers. Sure, there are some elements of truth to it, including evidence that US officials expected some sort of warlike action from the Japanese military. But the idea that Roosevelt would allow a highly destructive attack to hit a significant portion of the Pacific Fleet simply doesn't make sense. Like we already brought up, they knew something could, keyword could, be coming, but no one really knew where. And don't forget that the Philippines, Wake Island, and Hong Kong, among others, were all attacked that very same day. The idea that Roosevelt wanted to fight the Nazis so bad that he was just going to let Japan attack is inconceivable. If you want to be really fair, yes, the US knew something was afoot, it just had no idea where. History still trembles with the shockwaves of the only 2 nuclear weapons ever used on a population. But one thing's become clear in the decades since they fell. There are too many things that just don't add up.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima.
In general, government officials at the time believed the bombs were a necessity to avoid a far more costly invasion. President Truman is quoted as saying, "It was a terrible decision, but I made it. I made it to save 250,000 boys from the United States, and I'd make it again under similar circumstances." But if the intention was to force Japan's surrender, the bombs might have been totally unnecessary. Evidence suggests that Japan was ready to surrender before Hiroshima. First, a personal piece of correspondence penned by Emperor Hirohito and sent to Joseph Stalin asked that the Soviet premier act as an intermediary in negotiations between Japan and the US. It's not clear when Stalin received this letter, but it was definitely before the Potsdam Conference. the meeting between Allied leaders regarding the end of World War II, which took place from July 17th to August 2nd. Hiroshima wasn't attacked until 4 days after that. On top of that, a study called the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that Japan would have likely surrendered before the Allies could invade. In other words, before many of the casualties that U.S. officials feared. The report was finished in September 1945 and published the next month, so after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. It should be noted, though, that historians heavily debate these points. What's not debated is the role the USSR played in ending the conflict. Whether or not Japan was prepared to surrender beforehand, the typical narrative is that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the catalyst for the end of the war. On the surface, that seems consistent. Hiroshima was attacked on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, and Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. The timeline seems pretty cut and dry. But one thing most people don't look at is the fact that on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. That act might have a bit more weight to it than you thought. For context, the Soviet Union and Japan had entered into a neutrality pact in 1941. The agreement was beneficial to both countries because it allowed both of them to focus on fewer fronts during World War II. But as the war with Germany turned in favor of the Allies, Stalin warmed to the idea of joining in the war against Japan, even though the neutrality pact was technically still in effect. As such, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria the day after declaring war was nothing less than a betrayal. In just under a week, the Soviet army was moving on 3 different fronts against Japan, even finding success in areas of significant resistance. In discussions with his cabinet, Hirohito explicitly mentioned the Soviet Union in relation to surrender. The military situation has changed suddenly. The Soviet Union entered the war against us. Therefore, there is no alternative but to accept the Potsdam terms. We're not trying to downplay the decision to drop atomic bombs in some sort of modern-day retelling of history, but by Japan's own words, the Soviets played a major role in their surrender. With the Soviet Union on the rise, the end of World War II might be better analyzed as the start of the Cold War, as American leaders began exerting pressure on the Soviets. Though nuclear research had previously been kept secret from the USSR, Truman changed that policy as it became clear that the Soviets were poised to affect the balance of power in East Asia. The US preferred that the USSR be given as little power as possible in that situation, so Truman let it slip that American scientists had developed a uniquely deadly weapon. After all, as a deterrent, it's pointless if your enemies don't know you have it.
Whole point of the doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
Historians now know that the concept of a nuclear weapon had Joseph Stalin fairly concerned. Combine that fact with indications from that 1945 study that Japan would have surrendered without the atomic bomb, and you can now see how modern eyes view the bombings more as a show of force to the Soviet Union. The bombs were likely more of a show of power than a military strategy, giving the US a stronger bargaining chip when it came to post-war negotiations. Again, we're parsing this mainly on that 1945 study and the words of the Japanese leadership, and not factoring in all the other factors such as the never surrender mentality of the Japanese military and the horrific war crimes they carried out. So yes, you can blast us in the comments. Go ahead. We're just trying to show both sides here. Prior to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the US did technically take precautions to warn the civilian populations of their target cities. Airdrop pamphlets urged the Japanese people to pressure their government into surrender, making mention of an incredibly powerful weapon that they would face if the war continued. The pamphlets themselves contained intimidating images of American military might, as well as lists of cities that might be targeted for attacks. A reported 33 cities received at least one of the 3 versions of the pamphlet, each of which had a slightly different list of target cities. But 2 cities that weren't listed on any of them were, you guessed it, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Nagasaki makes sense since that wasn't on the initial list of targets, but Hiroshima is a strange omission. In the end, their citizens were entirely unaware that an attack was imminent, with reports from Hiroshima even explaining that the locals just thought it a beautiful normal day. Looking back at them today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki feel like 2 self-contained events relegated to their own dark shrine in history. But horrifying as it is to think about, there could have been many more bombings. See, even though the Trinity test had gone off without a hitch, the bombs slated for deployment were untested designs.
Could the bomb work? That would certainly have been the military view. We test them in action.
Scientists close to the project made a prediction about the atomic bomb's effect in a 1945 letter. In their own words, "It is doubtful whether the first available bombs, of comparatively low efficiency and small size, will be sufficient to break the will or ability of Japan to resist." Yeah, I got that one wrong. But believe it or not, even after seeing proof of their effectiveness, the US military was still ready to keep making and dropping even more bombs indefinitely. Shortly after the bombing of Nagasaki, military officials continued to make active plans for further attacks, including an outline that would include 7 more bombs deployed by the end of October that year. They were even planning the infrastructure needed to produce bombs consistently, at the rate of at least 3 per month. In a sense, it shows how the US military thought there would be no way that the Japanese would ever surrender. If there's one thing about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that almost everyone can agree on, it's that the radiation released by the bombs left thousands of people sick, and we now know what happened next.
The war ended, but not the dying. Radiation sickness would kill thousands more.
But some studies looking at survivors from the outskirts of the two cities suggest that the radiation wasn't always as damaging as commonly believed. In fact, it may have made some survivors healthier. The studies found that survivors who received low doses of ionizing radiation had a longer life expectancy and lower instances of cancer than the average population. Shocking findings, to say the least, considering everything we know about the dangers of radiation. The researchers chalked the phenomenon up to radiation hormesis, a theory that very low doses of ionizing radiation can actually be beneficial. Before you get up in arms in the comments again, we'll state for the record that organizations like the National Academy of Sciences and the United Nations don't recognize radiation hormesis as a valid theory, making these findings even more sketchy. And just to touch on one of the wildest stories to come out of the bombings, we have to mention Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who was in Hiroshima when Little Boy fell. He survived and went home to Nagasaki. On August 9th, he was telling a coworker about the bombing when Fat Man dropped.
He got 1,000 times the dose of radiation that we experienced in 1 year.
Against all odds, he lived a healthy life until he passed away in 2010 at the age of 93. Clearly, after almost 80 years to study the effects of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's still a lot we don't understand. In the present day, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are almost always mentioned in the same breath. A series of bizarre events and remarkably bad luck led to that. In their initial plans, officials were explicitly looking for large cities of military value. They put together a short list of 4 cities that all met their criteria: Hiroshima, Niigata, Kyoto, and Kokura, now part of Kitakyushu. In other words, Nagasaki wasn't the primary target for the atomic bomb. But in June, Secretary of War Henry Stimson suddenly changed the list for reasons still debated today. According to him, Kyoto was too important a cultural center to be destroyed. There's this story that he spent his honeymoon there. We know Stimson visited the city twice in the 1920s, but it wasn't for his honeymoon. Nagasaki was bumped onto the list of 4 candidates, literally handwritten into the new draft, but still in the last spot. Things only got worse from there. Cloudy weather in the days leading up to the second bombing forced plans to change, and at the very last minute, the planes couldn't get a clear visual over Kokura, pushing the pilots to make the switch to Nagasaki on the spot. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear warfare suddenly became a prominent and enduring threat. But in a mirror effect, the bombs also brought the potential for peace. Don't forget that the military thought that a deterrent had to be proven unequivocally in a theater of war, hence Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But before the bombs were ever dropped, scientists warned that doing so would have the opposite effect. See, folks were already concerned about what the future was going to look like with nuclear weapons now on the table. So in June 1945, a group of scientists who'd worked on the project penned what became known as the Franck Report, in which they argued that springing the bomb on the world would lead to deep distrust and further conflict. Later published in the 1946 issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the report stated that dropping the bomb on an enemy target would shatter any trust the world had in the United States' desires for truly lasting peace, saying, "It will be very difficult to persuade the world that a nation which was capable of secretly preparing and suddenly releasing a weapon as indiscriminate as the rocket bomb and 1,000 times more destructive is to be trusted in its proclaimed desire of having such weapons abolished by international agreement." Instead, they suggested detonating a bomb on an uninhabited island somewhere and inviting the world to watch, a demonstration of both power and restraint. In their words, America would be able to say to the world, "You see what a weapon we had but did not use. We are ready to renounce its use in the future." This is a theory that is often seen as a modern Monday morning quarterbacking of World War II, but obviously the controversy associated with dropping the bombs has been around since before they were used. Most Americans have heard the history of the American Revolution again and again, but no matter how much you think you know, there are plenty of things about the war that gave rise to our nation that don't make sense. Though teasing out the causes of the American Revolution is seriously complicated, one in particular stands out: representation.
Taxation without representation.
Exactly. It also doesn't just pop up out of nowhere right before the war. You see, in 1764, Massachusetts, colonist James Otis published the Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, in which he argued that giving the colonists a seat in government wouldn't weaken Britain, writing, "This would firmly unite all parts of the British Empire in the greatest peace and prosperity, and render it invulnerable and perpetual."
Even as we shoot down British soldiers, we will be winning rights their children shall enjoy forever.
Even if Britain didn't 100% agree, why didn't they change course when the rebellion turned into full-out war? Well, actually, they did. In 1778, Britain sent a group of representatives known as the Carlisle Commission to the colonies with a proposal: stop the war, and you can rule yourselves. But the members of the Continental Congress could feel the momentum of the revolution, not to mention that they were wary of allegations of corruption and collaboration with the commission. In other words, the enemy. They nixed the proposal, although a fun little what if is, would it have been so roundly rejected had all the representatives been there for the vote? Well, it's easy to understand why farmers and other working class folks might want freedom from the British Crown. A surprising number of elite upper class colonists were firmly in the Revolution camp as well. Take Virginia, for example. The higher ranking members of Virginia society got to North America by virtue of the colonial system. Not only that, they continued to enjoy plenty of big and little luxuries imported from Britain. So why would they choose to support a scrappy breakaway republic?
It's the time for choosing sides.
Turns out they did it for the most American of reasons. They couldn't get high-end goods. You see, as time went on, trade was hampered by British taxes, as were fancy foreign imports. Wealthy planters began to worry that their financial situation was being undercut by money-hungry Britain. Some were concerned that the growing discontent might shatter the social order, giving enslaved people the idea that they deserved equal rights. With that in mind, the revolution became a way for elites to maintain the financial and social order that elevated them without interference from Britain. And they were right. While slavery was outlawed across the British Empire in the 1830s, it took a bloody civil war and a constitutional amendment to outlaw U.S. slavery, which didn't happen until 1865. You don't have to do a deep dive into early American history to realize the colonists were never going to win a war against the all-powerful British by themselves. Luckily, France came along with a major assist. But while it's clear that France and a few other nations lent serious help to the budding republic, it's not so obvious why. At the time, France was a pre-revolution monarchy that supported both the aristocracy and Catholicism. Why would they train, supply, and fund a bunch of ragtag rebels facing off against a growing British Empire? For one thing, the ragtag bit is more of a myth than a strict reality. Moreover, the cultural differences between the American colonists and the French may not have been quite as stark as it sounds. Sure, King Louis XVI was still in power, but the Enlightenment had come to France in full force, bringing with it new ideas about society and government that were explicitly echoed in what Thomas Jefferson and company wrote in the Declaration of Independence. There were political factors to consider also. France and Britain had long been rivals, so helping the rebels meant striking a blow against an old enemy. Not to mention making friends with a new nation that produced all sorts of profitable crops and goods. That's likely the major reason why nations like Spain and the Netherlands joined France in supporting the not-so-ragtag revolutionists. Might as well profit and keep the Brits down. There were plenty of times during the American Revolution when George Washington barely escaped serious injury or death. He was the subject of a 1776 assassination plot, barely avoided being captured by the British in New York, and led its December 1776 surprise attack that could have proven disastrous, although it turned out to be the rebels' first real win of the war. Washington's closest brush with disaster came at the September 11, 1777 Battle of Brandywine.
Brandywine, Pennsylvania, the Americans fought the largest engagement of the war so far, and Washington suffered one of his worst losses.
British Lieutenant General Sir William Howe forced Washington's army into a battle at Brandywine Creek near Philadelphia. It was a loss for the Continentals, but not a crushing defeat, since many colonial soldiers managed to retreat safely. But Washington himself had an alarmingly close call. For a few moments at least, an enemy sharpshooter had him in his sights. His name was Captain Patrick Ferguson, widely touted as the best marksman in the British Army. Crouched along the creek, Ferguson saw a group of rebel officers pass nearby. He ordered the soldiers under his command to shoot, but canceled the order at the last second. According to the Philadelphia campaign by Thomas J. McGuire, Ferguson felt it was not pleasant to fire at the back of an unoffending individual who was acquitting himself very coolly of his duty. Pride in his craft kept Ferguson from taking out George Washington. It might be the biggest what if that would have completely changed America as we know it today. Charles Lee was a British officer who joined the colonists in 1775. He was commissioned as a major general in the Continental Army and at first enjoyed the acclaim of his fellow commanders, eventually becoming the Army's second in command. But Lee came into such frequent and dramatic conflict with Washington that his once stellar reputation began to tarnish. He's now considered one of the worst generals of the American Revolution. At the June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Washington criticized Lee for his messy, confusing command.
Lee's lack of confidence in his own men saw them abandon the fight within the first hour of battle.
Lee's response was so spicy that he was charged with insubordination and temporarily removed. Clearly not knowing when he ought to mind his manners, Lee became such a constant problem that he was accused of treason and permanently dismissed in 1780.
Removing Lee cemented Washington's unquestioned role as commander-in-chief for the remainder of the war.
While Lee's rash decisions are plenty confusing, an earlier incident in his career makes things even weirder. In 1776, after the British took New York City, Lee was captured and held a prisoner of war for 2 years. During that time, he wrote to Sir William Howe with inside advice on how to defeat the rebels, although those letters didn't become public until after Lee's 1782 death. There are accusations that he even came up with a concrete plan to hand the colonies back to Britain. Others wonder if he may have been a canny double agent or simply a difficult man who perhaps wrestled with untreated mental health issues. So who was the real Charles Lee?
It's a mystery! It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
In a war full of dramatic episodes, few are more gut-wrenching than the story of British Major John Andre. He's perhaps most notorious for basically being Benedict Arnold's connection, facilitating his betrayal and an attempted takeover of the fort at West Point, New York.
In exchange for £20,000, I shall transfer to you the plans for West Point.
The plot failed, and Andre was captured and executed in October 1780. Though Andre's execution was ordered by George Washington, the reasons aren't clear. Washington was said to have admired Andre and may even have seen him as a poor sap caught between two opposing sides. He even offered to return Andre to the British in exchange for Arnold, but was turned down. Something about the whole thing didn't make sense. The day before his death, Andre reached out to Washington for mercy, writing, "If aught in my character impresses you with esteem towards me, if aught in my misfortunes marks me as a victim of policy and not of resentment, I shall experience the operation of these feelings in your breast by being informed that I am not to die on a gibbet." Other officers thought Andre should at least be given the dignity of death by firing squad and not the hanging accorded to common criminals. Yet Washington and other Continental Army commanders voted to have him hanged anyway. Major General Nathaniel Greene argued that it was a fitting death for a spy. Washington never explained his decision. The rebels got a big assist from a group known as the Culper Spy Ring. They were based in Setauket, Long Island, and organized by a cavalry officer named Benjamin Talmadge.
What are you doing here? I saw Ben Talmadge trying to recruit me for a secret mission.
Many of those involved have since been revealed, including farmer Abraham Woodhull and sailor Caleb Brewster. But one member of the ring remains unknown to this day, Agent 355. Talmadge used numbers and code names known as the Culper Code to conceal identities.
355 in the Culper Code meant lady.
Agent 355 is mentioned just once by Woodhull, according to Morton Pennypacker's General Washington's spies, who quotes, "I think by the assistance of a 355 of my acquaintance, we shall be able to outwit them all." But a close reading, the assistance of a 355, reveals that Talmadge may not be speaking about a full-on spy, but using a generic term, not an actual code name.
This is war. You never know who's listening.
Still, people love to speculate about the mysterious woman's identity. Some folks point to Anna Strong, a Long Island resident who was Woodhull's neighbor and whose husband supported the rebellion. She allegedly communicated with agents, reportedly hanging a black petticoat on a washing line if a message was ready for pickup. Other candidates included a unnamed lover of Agent 723, Robert Townsend, and none other than Benedict Arnold's sweetheart, Peggy Shippen. The opening lines of the Declaration of Independence read, "All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
Not only a declaration of our independence, but of the rights of all men.
But dig a little deeper, and that notion is complicated by some of the founding fathers. In a 1776 letter to James Sullivan, John Adams contemplated the idea of letting non-elites vote. Adams thought the notion dangerous, or at least a major political headache, writing, "There will be no end of it. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to, and every man who is not a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state." Adams, the second U.S. president, was part of the land-owning elite guaranteed voting rights under the colonial system. He had an estimated net worth of $21.5 million in modern US dollars and owned a 40-acre estate. But skepticism about democracy wasn't an Adams-only problem. Other founding fathers were wary of populism and initially ensured that only members of the House of Representatives were elected by popular vote. In fact, senators weren't elected by popular vote until 1913, with the ratification of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Why exactly was it called D-Day? Did a soldier actually walk around Normandy Beach playing the bagpipes? Just because the legendary military operation went according to plan doesn't mean there aren't a whole lot of unanswered questions. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, was the result of years of planning, reconnaissance, international cooperation, and a complicated web of intentional miscommunications and double agent activity meant to confuse the Germans. And it all worked. Despite heavy casualties, the Allies won the day, and that victory led to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the other Axis powers. But the human cost was steep. We don't actually know how many people died that day. Some put the Allied deaths as low as 5,000, while others have it as high as 12,000. Most modern memorials list 4,414 Allied deaths, while at least as many Germans perished. No matter how much planning was done beforehand, the act of landing hundreds of thousands of soldiers on multiple beaches inevitably produced a deadly mass of confusion.
American troops caught between the sea and experienced Wehrmacht fighters are sitting ducks.
And while a valiant attempt was made to recover and record the remains of Allied soldiers in the battle's aftermath, some remains likely washed out to sea, leaving no trace. For obvious reasons, record-keeping wasn't at the top of anyone's mind in that moment. The Allied priority was to move inland and take German positions, while every soldier on both sides was fighting to stay alive. But the effort goes on today. Even 80 years later, there are organizations out there dedicated to recovering the remains of the missing and bringing them home to their families. One of the more ingenious Allied strategies in the lead-up to the D-Day invasion was called Operation Fortitude, and you probably didn't hear about it in history class. It involved large inflatable tanks, actually balloons, that were deployed across France to trick German forces into thinking the invasion they knew was coming was happening anywhere but Normandy. Fortitude North was staged in Norway, and Fortitude South misdirected the Germans to Calais and northeast France. But a few blow-up tanks wouldn't have been enough to fool the Germans. Fortitude worked on many levels. Radio operators put out false communications, while spies created fake underground chatter about the coming invasion. In Calais, inoperable aircraft were staged at various locations, as were landing craft made from heavy-duty fabric and wood. It was true wartime theater, and it was all set up as the 1st U.S. Army Group, or PUSAG. Of course, PUSAG didn't exist, but its commander, General George S. Patton, absolutely did. And Patton gamely showed up at dummy locations to deliver speeches and inspect what amounted to stage sets. It may well be that Patton's participation was the thing that convinced Germany PUSAG was real. After all, why would the US send one of its top generals north if a Calais invasion wasn't imminent? The ruse proved so effective that even after the D-Day invasion began in Normandy, Germany's 15th Army remained ready and waiting in Calais for a second invasion that never came. On the morning of D-Day, as thousands fought in Normandy, Hitler was sound asleep at his home in the Bavarian Alps. Even when news of the invasion reached Hitler's staff, they didn't wake him up. They'd been told to let him sleep, and nobody had the nerve to defy the order. When Hitler finally got up at around noon, he dragged his feet, assuming the invasion was a low-level distraction effort on the part of the Allies. It took hours and repeated urgent requests by his forces on the ground in Normandy before he agreed to redirect troops and weapons to defend the beaches. If he'd been awakened earlier by some brave aide, could Hitler have changed the course of that day? It's hard to tell, but he hadn't exactly distinguished himself as a military leader. He and his commanders had been fooled by Operation Fortitude, mustering forces in the wrong location. And when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel urged Hitler to boost defenses along the Normandy coast, Hitler told him to keep the deadly Panzer tank divisions inland. It's possible Hitler was just as effective a commander asleep as he was awake, but thankfully for the Allies, we'll never know. It's hard to overstate the importance of Juan Pujol Garcia's work during the war. The Spanish businessman was no fan of dictators, not Francisco Franco, and certainly not Hitler. As World War II became a reality in Europe, he offered his services to Britain as a double agent, but was turned down due to inexperience. Not to be deterred, Pujol went freelance. At first, he positioned himself as a fanatical pro-Nazi official employed by the Spanish government. The Germans then recruited him, ordering him to move to England to build a pro-Nazi network of agents. Instead, Pujol went to Lisbon and got to work. He would send fake reports to his Nazi contacts, sprinkling them with legitimate facts to make his lies more believable. In 1942, Pujol approached Britain's MI5 again, revealing himself to be the secret agent codenamed Garbo, who'd caught their attention even while remaining unidentified. This time, they brought him on.
The other day I was offered money to get information.
What sort of information?
Secret information.
As for his connection to D-Day, Pujol was a major part to the Allied victory. He once again set about lying to Nazi officials, insisting that rumblings about a Normandy invasion were nonsense. Then, very shortly before the actual landing, he leaked info to the Germans about Normandy. Too late, of course. Still, the intelligence was technically correct, which bolstered his authenticity as a German spy. After the war, Pujol remained an MI5 agent, helping to suppress a post-war Nazi revival. Eventually, he faked his own death to avoid Nazi revenge. He told his handler to inform everyone he died of malaria and then moved to Venezuela. This was so believable that most people, including Pujol's own family, believed he was dead until the 1980s. He died in 1988. Anyone who isn't hip to the jargon of military communiques may be wondering why we still call it D-Day when it happened in France on a Tuesday in June, some 80 years ago. It's because the D in D-Day refers to, well, day. More specifically, it was common in the Army to use the term D-Day for the first day of a given operation. In the similar vein, H-hour stands for the hour in which a given operation is set to begin. A simple system of pluses and minuses denotes days before or after a military action. For example, D+2 referred to June 8th, 2 days after the June 6th landings. There's actually a method to this rather vague standard. For one, being less specific allowed military commanders to be flexible with the dates in case the weather or something else changed the timeline. Furthermore, if there was a leak, enemy forces wouldn't necessarily be able to figure out what was going on because D-Day -2 was intentionally vague. As to why we still call it D-Day and not the Battle of Normandy or something else, absolutely no idea. The heavy equipment the Allies needed to land on Normandy beaches and move inland would have been a disaster on soft or boggy ground. For Allied commanders, the years-long process of planning D-Day therefore included sending out soil samplers. Yet for all their vital work, which required nerves of steel, these collectors are rarely mentioned. These men would approach French beaches as silently as possible, using small craft, sometimes even miniature submarines, then either swim or canoe to the shoreline. Once there, they would dig up sand and soil samples and tuck them away in a jar or bag before returning quietly to the ocean. Often, these missions would take place under cover of darkness, and of course, a variety of beaches were sampled with the assumption that German forces would notice and not be able to determine exactly where the invasion would begin. These intrepid scientists took other key measurements, including water depth and the way currents moved into and around the beach.
We need waves that are less than 5 feet. We're going to land at dawn. We'd like to have a half a moon. We'd like to have 2,500 feet of cloud ceiling.
The scientists' information was so important that it convinced Eisenhower to focus on Normandy, where more compact sand gave forces the best chance. Their intel also influenced some landing parties to include bombing tanks that laid down steel mesh, which allowed other vehicles to follow behind without sinking. The soil samplers played such a vital role in the invasion, it seems unfair they're not at least mentioned in history books. Although Field Marshal Rommel earned the grudging admiration of Winston Churchill and the nickname of the Desert Fox, his actual wartime record isn't very impressive. Among the many mysteries about D-Day is the question of how Rommel earned such a lofty reputation when he was caught totally flat-footed. In 1943, Rommel was given command of the German defense of Normandy. He directed personnel to plant landmines, build weapons platforms, thread terrain with barbed wire, and flood marshy areas to slow an Allied advance. He failed, however, to convince Hitler to send Panzer tank divisions to the region, which may have been a fatal error, but it wasn't all Hitler's fault. Rommel made some strange decisions too, especially considering the abundance of evidence that Allied forces were planning to invade somewhere in the region. But just 2 days before D-Day, or D-2, he left the front to celebrate his wife's birthday. Her gift that year? A nice pair of shoes.
He had believed too much in the German weather forecast, which had said on the 6th of June it will be poor weather.
By the time he made it back to the front, D-Day was effectively over and the war had begun its turn in the Allies' favor. Bagpipes aren't a subtle instrument. They're loud and they command attention. So why did one ballsy bagpiper play the pipes on Sword Beach while British troops advanced? And how the heck did he manage to survive?
Well, everybody else had guns in their hands and you had your bagpipes.
The piper in question was Bill Millen, a Scottish private then serving in the British 1st Special Service Brigade. Before his group was about to land, Millen's commanding officer had an idea that was both highly traditional and exceedingly unusual. That officer, Brigadier Simon Fraser, 15th Lord Lovett, was both a hereditary Scottish aristocrat and someone Hitler allegedly regarded as a terrorist. Fraser, seeing Millen in his kilt, suggested he break out the bagpipes. Millen noted that music making was technically banned, as it obviously attracted enemy fire. Fraser's reported response was that as the rule came from the English War Office and they were Scottish, they could disregard the order. So Millen went ahead, walking back and forth on a Normandy beach, taking fire and playing the bagpipes, all to raise morale. He also took on the traditional role of leading his group across a bridge. 12 soldiers were killed in that action. Later, Millen had a chance to talk to 2 captured German snipers from that day.
Yet once again, Tsutomu Yamaguchi walked away from a deadly nuclear blast with only minor.
Dig deep enough into the story of D-Day and you may come across Yang Kyung-jong. As it's typically told, Yang was a young Korean man who was conscripted into the Japanese army in the late 1930s. He was captured by Russia, then conscripted into that nation's service in 1942. Captured in Ukraine, Yang was then forced into the German army and sent to Normandy, where he was yet again captured, this time by Allies on D-Day. Transported to a POW camp in the US, he eventually became a US citizen and died in Illinois in 1992. His stories understandably captivated everyone, from action filmmakers to noted historians. Yang might be one of history's most unlucky people, if only he was real. If you take a more careful second look, his story quickly becomes hard to confirm. A photo that allegedly shows a war-weary Yang in German uniform doesn't use his name. Instead, its official entry in the National Archives only identifies him as a young Japanese man. Indeed, there's practically no documentation of a Korean man passed from army to army in the midst of this massive global war. There were Korean people who lived in Berlin under Nazi rule, but most appear to have returned to Korea by 1945. People of Asian descent fought at D-Day, including the unnamed Japanese man in a German uniform, and on the Allied side, multiple Chinese-American service members who stormed the beaches that day. But as far as Yang goes, he may make a great story, but he's as fake as a balloon pretending to be a tank. Faulty weapons, cover-ups, and atrocities that shock the conscience. We spent decades trying to make sense of the Vietnam War, with unanswered questions going back as far as the day the US got involved. And we might as well start with the one that started it all, the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident. What we know is that on August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox fired on 2 small North Vietnamese boats in its vicinity. It's not clear if the boats intended to attack. 2 days later, the Maddox saw signs on its radar that the crew interpreted as more boats. The ship's intelligence officer also received messages that he interpreted to mean an imminent attack. But when President Johnson was told this information, he ordered retaliatory bombings, regardless of the fact that no attack had actually happened yet.
The Johnson administration pretty much dismissed evidence indicating that an attack actually hadn't taken place.
It would later emerge that the intelligence officer was probably mistaken, and that the dots seen on the radar weren't boats at all, let alone ones shooting dozens of torpedoes at them, as the sailors first believed. In 1995, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara met retired General Vo Guyen Ziap and tried to settle the question once and for all. He asked if the attack on August 4th had actually occurred, and as historians have long suspected, the general said that no, it had not. The M16 rifle was the standard issue weapon for the troops arriving in Vietnam as early as 1965, and that was a big problem since the M16s turned out to be a disaster on the battlefield. Soldiers in a foreign country found themselves saddled with a weapon that jammed, failed to eject its cartridges, and needed to be fixed in the middle of battle. While they believed the weapons were essentially self-cleaning, this was untrue, and even less self-cleaning in the humid climate of Vietnam. Morale plummeted, and parents on the home front complained to Congress about their sons' useless weapons. That's right, the Army failed so badly here that soldiers told their moms. Many signs point to the US government knowing about the issues with the weapon before even issuing them. The M16 was tested before deployment, and it failed some of those tests. The fact that it was picked anyway might be because of how closely related it was to the M14, the rifle it was replacing. The Pentagon was allegedly resistant to change, so going with something similar made sense for them. Risks be damned. It wasn't until around 1968 that the M16 got the necessary improvements to be useful in Vietnam. Peace talks to end the war, known as Operation Marigold, were spearheaded by diplomats from Poland and Italy, along with a bit of quiet involvement from the Soviet Union. The main figure was Polish diplomat Janusz Lewandowski. Poland was a communist country at the time, so it had direct links to North Vietnam. The US, on the other hand, did not have any such diplomatic relationship, and both sides refused to come to the table until the other agreed to compromise. But thanks to Lewandowski's work, the US and North Vietnamese ambassadors to Poland agreed to meet in Warsaw in 1966. Days before this historic meeting was to take place, the US resumed bombing around Hanoi. Why this happened is unclear, though it's been blamed on simple incompetence. There was also a miscommunication about where the two men were supposed to meet. As a result, the planned meeting never happened and the war continued on. By the time Richard Nixon became president in January 1969, it was clear the Vietnam War was not going well. Yet Nixon didn't move to end U.S. involvement until well into the 1970s. Nixon was afraid that when U.S. troops left South Vietnam, it would immediately fall to North Vietnam, which would reflect badly on his leadership. So while he did reduce the number of U.S. troops in the country significantly, he did not talk about leaving altogether until he won re-election in 1972. That's 3 years of misery just for Nixon's benefit. Nixon would occasionally second-guess this decision for being too evil. Letting men die just so he could stay in power was hard on his conscience. Imagine that. But his Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger, who had no such qualms. Kissinger made sure Nixon stuck to the plan, making a senseless war last that much longer. If you're wondering why Kissinger won a Nobel Peace Prize but is today mostly remembered as committing war crimes, let's just say that Kissinger's reputation is as soiled as Nixon's nowadays. March 16, 1968 saw one of the lowest moments in U.S. military history, the My Lai massacre. Soldiers belonging to Charlie Company, 11th Brigade, Americal Division, entered the My Lai village and killed 300 unarmed civilians, including women and children. Not everyone in the village was slaughtered, and there are many first-hand accounts from survivors. It was abundantly clear that there was no way to justify the slaughter as an acceptable part of war. It was just mass murder.
Said shoot everything, man, woman, children, and the whole bit, everything that could aid the VC, every living thing.
Over 18 months later, the world was shocked to learn what happened at My Lai. Despite the horror, only one soldier was convicted for his actions in the village, Lieutenant William L. Cawley, who was sentenced to life but released on appeal in 1974. Blame for the massacre was placed on seemingly everyone and everything. The soldiers said they had been given permission to kill by their commanding officers. Over the previous months, Charlie Company had lost several members to mines and booby traps, all while never succeeding in engaging the enemy. They were frustrated and had already murdered one civilian woman in anger. And Cawley was said to have been bullied relentlessly by his commanding officer, building up even more stress. All of this built up to a horrific release of frustration as the division essentially lost their minds, taking that out on innocent villagers with a heartless massacre. The event that came to be known as the Green Beret Affair involved the US Army and the CIA, and both parties blamed the other for what happened. On June 20th, 1969, a Vietnamese man going by the name Thai Hoc Truyen was drugged by several Green Berets, taken out into the South China Sea in a boat, and shot in the head. His weighed-down body was then dumped overboard. Truyen was supposed to be assisting the US forces, but was suspected of being a double or possibly even triple agent. 8 Green Berets were eventually arrested for Truyen's murder, but the case against them fell apart when the CIA refused to let any of their employees testify. It turned out that while Green Berets do not normally fall under the CIA's purview, they were indeed working for them in this instance. However, the CIA denied they told the men to eliminate the alleged double agent. It denied even knowing him at all. On the other hand, the Green Berets said the CIA made it very clear Truyen needed to die. The one small silver lining about the Vietnam War is that it never went nuclear level bad, though it wasn't for lack of trying on the part of some in the US military. In 1968, General William Westmoreland was in charge of the military in Vietnam. He had long planned for a major battle to take place at a location called Khe Sanh. But when the North Vietnamese finally attacked the location, US troops had to be pulled away just days later to defend against the slew of attacks now known as the Tet Offensive. Westmoreland refused to abandon his original plan for Khe Sanh. Rather than lose the strategically important location, he wanted to use tactical nuclear weapons, or at least have them on hand in case it became necessary. He worked with other generals in the Pacific Theater on a plan to move nukes from Guam into the jungles of South Vietnam, codenamed Fractured Jaw. The problem was that the generals involved hadn't bothered to ask their commander-in-chief what he thought of the plan. When Lyndon B. Johnson learned what was up on February 2, 1968, the operation was well underway and he was furious. Despite this, the generals in Asia continued planning for another 10 days before finally ending work on Fractured Jaw. Fighting traditional wars is almost impossible in the thick jungles of Vietnam. Rather than adapt to the terrain, the US military attempted to change the landscape completely by carrying out Operation Ranch Hand, dropping what were known as rainbow herbicides on the country to clear huge areas of vegetation. The most infamous of these herbicides was Agent Orange, which was successful when it came to killing plants, and also turned out to be very effective at killing people. Dow Chemical and the other companies who produce the rainbow herbicides are certainly touchy about their involvement. To this day, Dow has an official statement on their website saying they were forced to make the herbicide due to the Defense Production Act, and that it is all the military's fault for the terrible health problems that it caused. However, there is evidence these companies both knew and hid how dangerous Agent Orange was from the government. By 1965, internal documents show that Dow knew that Agent Orange's ingredient dioxin was toxic. They even organized meetings with the other companies producing it to talk about how toxic it was. Despite that, they kept this knowledge from the government and publicly claimed the herbicides would not harm humans. And it gets worse. Almost a decade earlier, Dow knew how to lessen the amount of dioxin in Agent Orange without affecting its herbicidal abilities. It simply didn't do it. The conspiracy theory that the US government knowingly abandoned POWs in Vietnam was so widespread that it was a basis for the plot of Rambo First Blood Part 2. This conspiracy wasn't created out of thin air, as there are many soldiers who went to Vietnam and remain unaccounted for. As of 2022, the Defense POWMIA accounting agency listed 1,244 Americans as still unaccounted for in Vietnam. However, almost 500 of those individuals are considered non-recoverable, meaning there is evidence pointing to the fact that they died, but it can't 100% be proven because finding their remains may not be possible. In 2023, 4 more sets of remains were recovered and identified, with the US government promising to never stop searching. It's worth noting that there are thousands, yes, thousands of first-hand accounts seeing POWs alive in Vietnam after 1973, when all captured troops were allegedly returned to US forces. General John D. Lavelle commanded the 7th Air Force in Vietnam, and in 1972 it appeared the campaigns he was leading were doing well. So it was shocking for him when he was suddenly told to return to the US, where he was hauled in front of Congress to be dressed down and demoted 2 stars before being forced to retire. He died 7 years later, but well into the 21st century, his family still had questions about what exactly happened and why he was punished. Lavelle wanted to make sure more of his pilots came back from bombing missions alive, so he asked that the rules of engagement be made a bit looser. Lavelle claimed he was told that was fine, but for various political reasons this could not be put in writing. His version of events is backed up by several tapes recorded by President Richard Nixon in the Oval Office. After a misunderstanding of one of his orders, Lavelle was accused of telling his subordinates to falsify reports to make their bombing raids look legal, even if they weren't. This would have been raids that were illegal even under the looser rules of engagement. While Nixon is also on tape expressing anger at what was happening to the general, Lavelle was thrown under the bus by his superiors. One possibility is that they were trying to keep any information about other bombing raids from reaching the public, which, considering everything else that got covered up about Vietnam over the years, it's pretty easy to believe. You probably know the Dunkirk story, or maybe you've even seen the Christopher Nolan movie, but you still can't help but wonder, how could such a massive military defeat be seen as a miracle by so many? So before the Battle of Dunkirk, the Allies were definitively losing to the Nazis. After the fall of Poland, Britain and France were reluctant to engage the Germans directly. This led to several months of a phony war. Around 400,000 British Expeditionary Force troops, a fraction of what would have been needed, were stationed in Belgium to help repel the Germans. The problem was, Allied brass were old-fashioned, fixated on old ideas about warfare, and they were constantly arguing among themselves about what the next move should be. They assumed, wrongly, that the Germans would attack along the Maginot Line. Instead, the Nazis attacked Belgium through the Ardennes Forest, a blitzkrieg as we know it now, which the Allies had once again wrongly judged impossible for tanks to penetrate.
It was a high-risk strategy. The German armor could become stuck in the forest, but Hitler loved it.
In a colossal misjudgment, the Allies had stationed no reserves behind the front lines, something Prime Minister Winston Churchill was only told later on. By the time he found out, the situation was hopeless. The British forces had no choice but to fight their way back to Dunkirk and hold out until rescue arrived from the sea.
On May the 23rd, General Alan Brooke, commander of British II Corps, wrote, "Nothing but a miracle can save the British Expeditionary Force."
In the British press's rush to portray Dunkirk as a miraculous escape achieved by the pluck and gallantry of their valiant army, they overlooked a major contributing factor. The only reason the Allies had time to pull off the massive evacuation was because the Germans halted their advance on Dunkirk on May 22nd. That move is now considered one of the greatest mistakes of World War II, and the decision came from Hitler himself.
And Hitler said, well, I am the boss. I take a decision.
Why the Fuhrer would order a halt at that precise moment has long baffled historians. One surprising theory suggests that he possessed a shred of sympathy for the Allies, or at least for the British. According to Louis Kiltzer's book, Hitler's Traitor, General Hans Jesenek claimed that Hitler considered the English and the Germans to be kindred souls. That at the heart, and we're talking about Adolf Hitler here, he didn't want to humiliate the British and resented Churchill for not appreciating his restraint. But knowing who Hitler was, that sounds unlikely. Fortunately, the Nazis documented everything, and there's plenty in the surviving paperwork that cast doubt on the Hitler loved the English theory. Others have argued that Hitler, who wasn't terribly insightful on military matters, had gotten paranoid about Germany's string of military successes. Being ultra superstitious, he was afraid fortune would turn against him, and Hermann Göring took advantage of Hitler's paranoia to convince him to hold back the army. For Göring, this gave his Luftwaffe the chance to hog the glory for themselves. Still, another theory is that an Allied counterattack, doomed though it was, had a powerful psychological effect on Hitler and his field commanders, who were then compelled to quell the resistance they met en route to Dunkirk. As the Allies fell back to Dunkirk, Britain's continued resistance to the Nazis seemed very much in question. Winston Churchill was only just installed as Prime Minister, and his hold on the job was tenuous. As dead set as Churchill was against appeasement, the Nazi high command knew that factions of the British aristocracy were convinced their country could not hold out, and that it was better to make peace with Germany. As for the British commanders in the field, while they weren't appeasement-minded, they were certainly pessimistic. According to Ronald Atkin's book Pillar of Fire, this was the moment when Lord Gort, leader of the British Expeditionary Force, admitted, "You know, the day I joined up, I never thought I would lead the British Army to its biggest defeat." The Germans, on the other hand, were filled with confidence. In a piece that appeared in The Atlantic, journalist William L. Shire, who was embedded with the German army, reported, "Morale of the German troops is fantastically good. German military circles in Berlin tonight put it flatly. They said the fate of the great Allied army bottled up in Flanders is sealed." Churchill later said that Hitler's poor decision-making at Dunkirk was the result of overconfidence. On May 28th, just as British and French forces managed to fall back behind the Belgian army, Belgian King Leopold III surrendered to Nazi Germany. It's been said that Leopold sprung his decision on the Allies without notice, but that's not true. He'd warned them that if Belgium's situation looked hopeless, he planned to surrender. Still, the timing of the decision shocked the Allies. Even before his surrender, Leopold frustrated the Allies. He and his commanders repeatedly bungled communications so that they never knew what to expect. Tensions with France got so bad that the French government tapped the Belgian embassy's phones to keep track of what was happening. Still, all the way up to the surrender, Leopold's army fought valiantly against the Nazis. As for Leopold, all was not forgiven after the war. Both the British and the French continued to resent him, and he was estranged from the British royal family for the rest of his life. General Erwin Rommel, commander of the 7th Panzer Division during the Battle of Dunkirk, was taken by surprise by British resistance. British forces had very few tanks, and few of those were enough to hold up against German artillery. Rommel was mad and maybe a little embarrassed that the British had managed to outwit him, so he helped persuade Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to divert the Panzer divisions against Allied counterattacks rather than heading for Dunkirk. Big mistake. That was just one of the strange decisions made on the micro level by the Germans that had serious consequences. On an even smaller scale, according to Julian Thompson's Dunkirk, Retreat to Victory, the British 44th Division was pretty much reduced to traveling back to Dunkirk on foot, giving the German tanks and motorized troops a huge opportunity to cut them off. But for some reason, they didn't. And although the British were hugely outgunned, they still managed to take advantage of the German hesitation to inflict damage on their enemy. As the last of the Allies standing after the Battle of Dunkirk, it's understandable that the British press zeroed in on British valor. But French forces played a pivotal role in keeping the shores secure, and their contribution remains underappreciated to this day. There's also a myth that the French were abandoned by the British at Dunkirk.
No French. English only. English only past this point.
Actually, some 140,000 French soldiers were rescued during the evacuation. Part of the reason for the false narrative is the lack of communication at the time of the battle. According to the National Archives, British commanders assumed that as soon as retreat and escape became the game plan, they'd be rescued by British ships, and the French by theirs.
You've got your own ships, this is a British ship.
The French had sent no ships because they hadn't planned to evacuate. Their navy was in the Mediterranean as part of a prior agreement with the British, and Lord Gort, who commanded the British forces at Dunkirk, was tactless and hostile to his French partners. Nonetheless, Britain was informally committed to helping as many French troops escape as it could. By the end of the evacuation, they were moving French and British troops in equal number, and most of the French rear guard was rescued at the beginning of June 1940 at Churchill's insistence. The evacuation of Dunkirk took place over 9 days, between May 26th and June 4th, 1940. The German advance resumed on the first day of the evacuation, and by May 31st, Field Marshal Georg von Küchler was receiving intelligence on the movement of the Allies. According to Walter Lord's The Miracle of Dunkirk, a number of suggestions based on the position of the Allies were relayed to Küchler by Army High Command. One proposal was to take German troops out to sea and land them behind the British. Another was to reposition German forces to give the Luftwaffe a clean shot at the enemy. Hitler himself, annoyed at the sandy beach's diluting effect on artillery shells, wanted them fitted with time fuses. Küchler rejected every suggestion sent his way. He had already made his plans: a steady bombardment to wear down the Allies and then an all-out assault along the perimeter on June 1st. The fact that intelligence had intercepted communications revealing the British had already moved from the east and were vulnerable as they fell back made no difference to him. He even got a break in the weather. Several days of clouds and fog had prevented the Luftwaffe from attacking. But his preparations continued without change, and no one at German headquarters bothered to question the wisdom of sticking to the script. At the same time that the British and French were trying to escape Dunkirk to fight another day, elements in the British government were prepared to end the war altogether. Peace with Germany was an active discussion within the War Cabinet, despite Churchill's refusal to consider it. Among those considering a negotiated peace was Edward Wood, better known to history as Lord Halifax. Halifax had seen Neville Chamberlain's efforts fall to pieces, and he wasn't sympathetic to the Nazis, but he was convinced that victory for the Allies was impossible. Halifax's plan was to propose peace while France was still in the war, and Britain's air force was relatively unscathed. With some fights still left in the Allies, Halifax reasoned that Britain could negotiate terms that would safeguard most of the British Empire and let it carry on a stable, if not particularly happy, coexistence with Germany. Meanwhile, Churchill stood his ground, but had to be careful not to wound the Conservatives' pride to the point that they resigned and collapsed the government, all while the men of Dunkirk were being rescued off the beach.
Churchill got a lot wrong, but if you're going to get one thing right, the Second World War is pretty high up there.
Had Halifax prevailed, Britain would have explored peace options using fascist Italy as an intermediary. But Churchill managed a 1-2 punch of internal diplomacy on May 27th, somehow soothing Halifax while delivering his famous battle cry: "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood on the ground." When thinking about the Battle of Dunkirk, one fact looms over the entire operation. It was a massive defeat for the Allies. The blitzkrieg tactics of the Germans overran British and French forces within weeks. Thousands were killed. The numbers vary wildly, with the high end being 90,000 left behind, as was nearly all the heavy artillery that the British had brought with them. Don't get too caught up in the actual number. The takeaway is that Dunkirk was perhaps Britain's greatest ever military defeat, and Winston Churchill publicly acknowledged it was a colossal military disaster. And yet, Dunkirk brought about a near immediate reversal of the British morale. The mood in the United Kingdom, which was almost funereal when the evacuation began, turned euphoric by the time the army returned. That shift was in part due to the realities of 1940s communication. A grim letter from King George VI suggesting bleak odds had been published at the same time that the evacuation was picking up steam, making the survival and rescue of so many troops seem that much more of a miracle. But the British press also leaned into the framing of Dunkirk as a miraculous feat, a divinely guided victory snatched from the jaws of disaster. They played up the parts of the little ships, those civilian craft with crews that provided much-needed support but actually weren't nearly as decisive as the media claimed. Sober assessments of British losses went basically unheard, even if they came from the Prime Minister. Dunkirk was a decisive moment, and Britain needed the miraculous, heroic version of the battle to steel itself for what lay ahead. UFO sightings, a mysterious spy master, and a fake doctor. There's a lot people don't know about the Korean War, and some of it just doesn't make sense. Nearly 5 years after the end of World War II, the United States and China found themselves tangled in another brutal conflict, this time on the Korean Peninsula. One of the biggest enigmas to come out of the war was a man named Donald Nichols. A remorseless operative able to watch mass killings and torture with cold indifference, Nichols proved himself to be the ultimate spy master. He was also able to make some very cold decisions. Nichols and his team of spies supplied most of the bombing targets for the US military during the conflict. Author Blaine Harden, who penned King of Spies, The Dark Reign of America's Spy Master in Korea, writes that Nichols actually predicted a Korean Civil War and warned higher-ups months before June 1950. Shortly after the war began, Nichols found himself at the center of arguably the conflict's greatest intelligence victory when he came across a North Korean defector who had stolen military code books in his possession. How all this could be attributed to a single man is puzzling. Nichols was a 7th grade dropout who grew up in poverty. He joined the military to survive, had no Ivy League or Pentagon connections, and showed up in Korea in 1946 with no support. And then he just happened to become buddies with South Korean leader Syngman Rhee. Their friendship launched Nichols' intelligence career into a different stratosphere and raises a lot of questions about him that his background on paper really doesn't answer.
Well, he was smart, he was ruthless, and he was brave.
Lots of things are flying around in the sky during war, but the Korean War featured quite a few instances that nobody could explain. On January 29, 1952, the crew of an American B-29 bomber reported seeing a floating disc-shaped object while flying a late-night mission over Wonsan. The crew noted that the object looked orange and also sported bluish flames around its odd shape. When the object was spotted, the bomber was more than 20,000 feet in the air and going nearly 200 miles per hour. A blurry shape spotted under these circumstances could easily be discounted, except for one problem. A completely separate B-29 bomber nearly 100 miles away also reported seeing a strange flying object, except this crew claimed it was more globe-shaped, which is equally weird. And if this wasn't strange enough, the year before, in May, a group of American troops claimed to have encountered a jack-o'-lantern-shaped object while readying to launch artillery on a village. The aircraft was allegedly undamaged in the midst of artillery strikes and rifle fire. It reportedly moved side to side and emitted flashing lights. Some of them even reported some kind of ray or beam being emitted from the aircraft. You might never have heard of him, but Fernando Waldo Demara Jr. might be the Michael Jordan of stealing identities. Demara made his way through life wading through numerous careers and impersonating countless people, but his most notorious and egregious con came during the Korean War. During the war, he pretended to be a doctor after making copies of a Canadian friend's immigration paperwork. The Massachusetts-born Demara was able to enlist in the Canadian Navy under his friend's name, Dr. Joseph Sear, and served aboard a destroyer in Korea as a commissioned officer. Demara's stint as a doctor would culminate in him treating 3 Korean refugees, one of whom needed to have a leg amputated. Shockingly, Demara successfully performed the procedure. However, the good press Demara received for his efforts earned the attention of the real Sear's mother. After she saw a photo of Demara posing as her son, the lie came to light, and he was forced to return to the US. But that doesn't mean he changed his ways. Before long, he went right back to stealing identities just for the love of the game. What makes Demara's stint in the Korean War so puzzling is that the incident was his 3rd time fooling military officials. Prior to joining Canadian naval ranks, Demara enlisted in the US Army in 1941, went AWOL, and stole a friend's identity to join the Navy, where he received basic medical training. After higher-ups discovered some of Demara's phony paperwork, he faked his death. His 2 desertions caught up with him in 1945 when he was caught and made to spend 18 months in prison. Sometimes prison revolts work. US Army Brigadier General Francis Dodd found that out the hard way. Dodd served as the commander of a prisoner of war camp on Gojedo Island. On May 7, 1952, Dodd was surrounded by a group of North Korean prisoners and taken hostage. He was released 3 days later, only after their demands for more humane treatment were seemingly guaranteed. The prison compounds on the island had a volatile reputation. Riots were not entirely uncommon. The prison population was understandably unhappy, and before the incident with Dodd, there had been another instance of a colonel being taken hostage, so it's not like this hadn't happened before. North Korean POWs, it turned out, were pretty good at taking their jailers hostage in order to improve their conditions. Direct action gets the goods. The POWs were helped by lax security at the camp. Gates at the compound were often left unlocked for endless comings and goings of different work details, and that lazy approach to security is exactly how the POWs were able to seize Dodd. Dodd also seems to have been a pretty trusting guy, recklessly so. Dodd reportedly arrived for a meeting with the prisoners on May 7th unarmed, meeting them by an unlocked sally port. While Dodd was not harmed in the incident, his career was effectively ruined, with the ordeal proving pretty embarrassing for military leadership. American intelligence during the initial stages of the Korean War was nothing short of abysmal. Before June 1950, little was done to heed South Korean warnings regarding communist forces gearing up to cross the 38th parallel. The newly formed CIA seemingly blew off its own intelligence reports that warned of North Korean military buildup. When Kim Il-sung finally made his move, only a hasty, disorganized, and unprepared intervention from American troops stationed in Japan was able to halt a total North Korean takeover of the peninsula. One would think this ordeal would make American intelligence hyper-aware and a lot more hawkish in the future. However, as the months rolled by, American leadership still wasn't listening to info on the ground. General Douglas MacArthur himself expressed extreme confidence that China would not enter the conflict. His mindset was that even if Mao's forces did join the fighting, they'd be easily thrown back. Well, Mao's forces did intervene in late October, and they drew UN troops into a hellacious firefight for the remainder of the year. This prevented North Korean capitulation and prolonged the war for years. One of the most bewildering moments of the Korean War was when General Douglas MacArthur thought it was a good idea to become embroiled in a rather public rivalry with President Harry Truman over how the United States should proceed with the conflict. Truman was none too pleased with MacArthur in the war's early going, especially after those personal assurances about China. By the spring of 1951, Chinese forces had turned back UN momentum and a stalemate began forming along the 38th parallel. MacArthur wanted to start employing more aggressive strategies, such as bombing China and allowing nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan into the war. Such moves, Truman feared, would escalate the conflict into something far more global. MacArthur, never one to shy away from letting his opinions be known, ended up writing a letter in March 1951 to the Republican Speaker of the House in which he essentially tossed Truman's wartime strategy under the bus. By April 11th, the general was officially relieved of his duties.
But I was through with him.
For a long while, the official recorded number of Americans killed during the Korean War was listed as 54,246. This figure was written into history books and etched onto monuments, including the granite of the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Nowadays, the official number of Americans who died during the war is stated to be much lower at around 36,516. That's a difference of nearly 18,000. So what caused this discrepancy? Apparently, it all came down to a simple clerical error. That error added all worldwide non-combat fatalities to the number of Korean War deaths, meaning that during this time period, a serviceman dying in Europe of non-combat causes was counted among the number of Americans killed in Korea. By 1989, Pentagon officials had decided to own up to the mistake and began revising numbers. So if you think you messed up at work today, it could be worse. This mistake was literally historic. Taking place between World War II and the Vietnam War, the Korean War is often overshadowed by those conflicts. It is commonly referred to as the Forgotten War, which many historians find baffling, because this was not a minor conflict. Historians have estimated that between 2 and 3 million North and South Korean civilians were killed during the conflict. According to scholars, this means that the percentage of civilian casualties in the Korean War likely eclipses that of World War II and the Vietnam War. During the war, American air campaigns likely saw about 635,000 tons of bombs dropped onto the Korean peninsula. These bombings, which were primarily concentrated in the north and included over 32,000 tons of napalm, are comparable to the number of bombs dropped on Japan during World War II. To this day, these airstrikes continued to serve as a significant cornerstone for state propaganda. They helped shape the North Korean national identity and have fueled justification for the country's anti-American, anti-Western policies. With the Korean War being such a brutal and bloody struggle, and with its aftermath still playing a crucial part in geopolitics today, there's just no good reason to regard it as a war worth forgetting.